right. So, good morning.
Morning.
Oh, wait for the last couple of people coming in. Take a seat. Thanks for coming out so early. You're very brave people, and we have a full room, so that's nice. Especially considering boring is in the title of this talk. It's very cool of you to be here. So what's on for today? We're going to write some code, but first I'm going to talk for a while. We'll see how long that takes. I want to talk about why you should care about boring software, what it is, in that order, and then we're going to write some boring software. So that's what we're going to do. I hope everyone is excited. A lot of fun. So my name is Lorenz, and I make software boring. I'm a DevOps lead at Channable. It's a thing in Utrecht. We've been doing Haskell in production for about 2.5 years. We use it for a bunch of stuff. This is roughly in order of how we started doing this. Some of it is open source as well. So if you want to take a look at actual production Haskell code, you can do so. You can find it on GitHub. Some stuff is application. The first two GitHub links are. And the last one is a library. It's the fastest implementation of AO Corasic in Haskell. It's pretty cool. And we also have a tech blog. If this is all interesting, we're hiring. So what did I learn about software while working at Channable or working in general? And what do I mean when I call software boring? And what does this all have to do with Haskell? We're at a Haskell conference, right? So those are a bunch of questions. So before I answer these, I want to ask you a question myself. And that's, what makes software expensive? Time?
Engineering time.
Engineering time.
Support.
Support?
Complexity.
Complexity?
Bugs.
Bugs?
Maintenance.
Maintenance? Yes, so if you can choose from these four, which one is the most expensive? Haskell itself. All right. Hearing maintenance a lot. Yeah, you get the point. Maintenance by a stretch. I've did a little internet search on like actual numbers. The numbers vary a lot depending on the papers you're looking at, but numbers of like 50% of total cost of ownership going into maintenance, these show up a lot. And depending on what you count as being maintenance and count as not being maintenance, it could go up like enormous amounts. Any continued software development after initial release could be called maintenance. If that's the case and you're in a product company, maintenance, yeah, that's like everything you do. So lots of time in maintenance means that if your maintenance is efficient, you get a bunch of money. And besides a programmer, I care about business, so I also care about money. But if you don't, your manager probably cares about it, or their manager. And talking in their language, or in a language of dollars, is very effective on getting what you want. So because maintenance is change, if you can make change easy, you can save money. So how do we do change effectively? Well, how do we do change effectively? You make change easy, and then you make the easy change, right? It's a very old saying, but the first part, actually making change easy, is where all the effort is spent, and it takes a lot of time. So the first one may be difficult, and it will cost you some time and expertise and engineering effort to allow you to continue making changes as easy as when you first started developing stuff. Change and maintenance are very intrinsically related to my view on software and also on boring software. So boring software has some qualities or attributes of this. It solves the actual problem you're trying to solve. It can be changed later because change always happens. Maintenance is always part of your software, and it does not feel like a roller coaster ride when you do so. It increases the life expectancy you as a programmer have because you're executing actually doing the maintenance. Boring domain does not mean boring software. A domain can be very boring. A domain can be very complex. A domain can be very not complex. Saving some blog posts to a database is not a very technically interesting domain. So some might call it boring because it's done a lot. But you can have software that is not very boring doing boring things. So your blog will catch fire every 2 releases. Then that's not boring software, that's a boring domain. So the former is common and the latter is more rare. And getting software in a boring state is much more difficult than getting the domain in a boring state. You can't change the domain even. So this is a Haskell conference. So people expect me to go and talk about Haskell as if it's silver bullet and will solve all your problems. That's especially not the case. It just isn't. But Haskell does contain a few features which make it easier to write boring software, given that you choose wisely and use them wisely. And I think Haskell can help, but I also think that you can get into the weeds with Haskell if you think it will solve all your problems and don't look critically at what you're doing with it. So as an example, right? What does this function do? It does I/O, right. But what? You can't really tell, right? So there's a string and int, and it does some I/O. Okay, so but that's nice, right? It's even better than we have in some imperative languages where you cannot even see this does I/O or not, based on opaque parameters in a bat function name. This is the same signature but a different function name. Does this give you any better ideas? Yeah, that's a very good guess. So documentation and naming is already very important, and that's something that is outside of Haskell. It's not unique to Haskell. You just are gonna need it. But there's still what's the string, what's the int, and what's the other int? Mm-hmm.
It would have been better to introduce, I don't know, by new types or type aliases some meaningful. Yeah, exactly. So
Yeah.
First,
Yeah, so the host is the string, right? There's a port, and there's also seconds. And seconds is the default timeout for new connections. But looking at the signature, if you're the first signature does not give you a lot of information because the naming is opaque. The second signature gives you some, as the programmer, some information because of naming. And the third function signature gives you, as the programmer, information because of the naming of the types. But because there are types, you also give the compiler information. And that can be very powerful because then the compiler can take a look and see, okay, you cannot switch up ports and seconds when passing values into this function. And it can be very, very helpful, especially if your software grows. So the types provide documentation, clarify intent, and prevent errors. This kind of, as a footnote, it can become a bit verbose if you couple it with a bunch of things. it's always a trade-off. I generally wager this kind of stuff. It makes your life easier, and you should do it. Yes?
Now we can name it full and still make some sense.
Yeah, you can also do that, right? And so that's going even further. And some people in Haskell try to make a sport out of giving things obscure names and then trying to see if you can still make sense out of it. Shots fired. Never mind. So what do I want to do with you today and Friday? I want to write a piece of software which does something in a boring domain, but let's see if we can also make it boring software. The domain is writing a database migration tool for Postgres. And the goal for you is to learn about some Haskell libraries we'll see along the way, find out how they can help you, find out what choices they make in their APIs to give you some type safety or not, and when they do so and when they do not, and that kind of stuff. And something which is a bit more like soft skills architecture type stuff. We won't only look at Haskell stuff. I also ask you to do some like thinking about architecture and how would this work given goals and that kind of stuff, because I consider that to be a very integral part of software in itself. And like you as a programmer also need to be involved with the spec and actually understand the spec, maybe even come up with the spec to get to the software being boring, not just the domain being boring. So we're going to start minimal, do the simplest thing that could possibly work, expand on features later, and we'll use fancy language extensions, libraries, if we're going to need them. We'll see how far we get today. We might not even get to the very fancy extensions, libraries, that kind of stuff. So sorry. So like I mentioned, let's first do some spec work. Take a look at the time. Yeah, this is going to be fine. I want to discover and or define some goals for this kind of piece of software. And I want to think through the architecture. And I want to have a discussion about that. And I want to avoid the just start coding mentality. So why care about spec work? Like I mentioned, it's critically important to do this in order to achieve boring status. I write most of my code while under the shower, and I have a little anecdote. But Sid, would you mind if I rehash that little discussion we had about CRDTs from yesterday? All right. This is a recent story for the importance of spec work. Sid was asking me yesterday about CRDTs. If you don't know what that means, it's a conflict-free replicated data type, and Sid wanted a CRDT for JSON or for maps. Like that's difficult, but that doesn't even matter because I started asking these whole bunch of why questions. Why do you need it? Why do you need it? Why do you need it? Why do you need it actually in your UI? What do your users care about? Is the standard CRDT behavior actually a part of what your users want? And it turns out, well, I didn't know. So I'm not an expert in CRDTs. I'm just an expert in asking the why question and then doing that a lot. But we found out that this whole kind of fancy software thing, it wasn't really needed. And that's an actual problem that Sid was trying to solve. Spec work and goals and thinking in terms of these goals is critically important if you're going to get to an implementation and an architecture which is the simplest it can possibly be, or is just simple enough for the complexity you actually require, where require is coming from your business goals. So that's a little reason about why we're doing this. So the goals serve as a guide for your project vision and allow you to make decisions on architecture and a bunch of other things. And these are a prerequisite for any opinion about project implementation and or architecture whatsoever. You cannot have an opinion about the implementation or about an architecture without knowing any goals. So functional goals for schema control, the thing we're building. These are it. It should change the schema of a Postgres database. It should do upgrades and downgrades of that schema, so you can go forwards and backwards in time on the same database, and maybe you make a mistake and you want to roll back and stuff. It should support all the features that you could possibly use in a Postgres database, and it should be able to be used in polyglot projects. So this tool should also be useful if you're doing, say, Python, or if you're doing, say, PHP. So I think these are, like, if you take a look at this, it's like reasonable business-ish type. We want this to do something, and we have some constraints, right? And I also have some non-functional goals, so qualitative goals. It should be easy to use. It should be reliable and predictable. Ideally, people using it don't have to learn a bunch. And it should be thin on complexity. I had this whole story about complexity, but I won't bore you with that. Ask me over lunch. So yeah, we have some goals, right? So my exercise for you is think of an architecture. Think of given these specific goals, think of possible solutions that could satisfy this, or reasons why they don't. In terms of responsibilities, inputs, outputs, interface, so the form of delivery maybe, and try to get your design mind going a bit. And I'll get some water, and we'll, while you're pondering this, we can have a discussion after.
Jakby tam loże na dole.
Oh yeah, that's probably useful. Thanks. Put this one here if anyone else needs the Wi-Fi password. All right, do we have some ideas, or do you still need a few minutes? Okay, still need a few minutes. This might help also.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
I might have missed it if you already said, so I get the function. In terms of, I guess the high-level question is how exactly is this thing going to be used? Not in terms of the details of the interface. But is a human being doing this on demand? Is this a CI system?
Oh, that's a very good question. Any other CI system?
CI system, it could be a dev tool where you're doing something as someone's iteratively putting together a program. It could be someone, an administrator is running something on a production application by hand to support release. Again, CI would be testing on demand, and no human is actually touching it. You just have a script running it somewhere. Probably a few other alternatives I'm not thinking of.
Yeah, this is a very, very good question. So. Are the goals, that's also part of this kind of stuff, are the goals exhaustive enough? In this case, I was going through, in my mind I had something a developer could use on a local machine, but also take the migrations that they write on their local machine and apply them to a testing database and a production database. Not necessarily that it should actually set up a whole bunch of connections, but that the information is in the tool to theoretically add this as a nice feature later. Are there any other questions regarding these goals? Does anyone want to have an idea? Like, what could we do? Yes?
We might want to set up some DSL for defining a schema.
Yeah.
Essentially, and then perhaps they would commit that into a folder of here's all my versions, and
Yeah.
we're able to sort of diff between them and make the appropriate SQL changes.
Okay. Sounds like a good idea. Are there any other ideas of what we might do architecture-wise?
We can just write SQL outer SQL queries actually.
Yeah.
I don't know how to call it, but we can just like use Postgres features to implement this functionality.
Okay. Sounds also very plausible. Are there any other ideas of what we could try and do?
I guess if I had to do this, I would go through whatever other people are doing. I've been doing base for some time, so I would guess I would get to how that works, or to the points.
Yeah. And are there any comparative tools and like what trade-offs do they make? How are they in terms of user experience? That's also a very good question. Are there any other kind of things we could sort of try and do in order to get more information at this point? Do you agree with me that just starting to code is not going to get us anywhere? Like we don't have any idea of what we're making, so opening a text file and typing a bunch of code to open connections with databases and do stuff like that won't help us at this stage. Do you agree with me on that? Okay. Then I'm glad. So yeah, some possible approaches. We can do an EDSL for migrations. We can have some sort of canonical schema definition somewhere. Like, this is the final version of my schema that I want. Make the user edit that. Compare with some running database instance and auto-generate migrations. This is something which is happening in the Alembic tool. It's written in Python. We can even make the user define types and infer a schema based on types, compare and auto-generate. So these are possible solutions in the design space.
That one won't work for every language.
That's true. That's true. So we came up with some possible approaches where we could be in the design space, and now, given these approaches, we can start comparing them to our goals that we just defined. So indeed, we want it in polyglot projects. What would it take to make this work in polyglot projects? A lot of work in order to get infer schema based on types working for every language and get it working consistently and have it make sense for that language. So you could do a bunch of things. This is what I propose we do. Because indeed we have polyglot projects. We want all SQL features. We want it to be easy to learn. That points us, in my opinion, into a direction, which is the same that you suggested. Like, use SQL. See if that can get us anywhere. Because SQL is not just an embedded DSL, it's an actual DSL, the one true database DSL. And if you're doing this, you don't need to. Write support for every specific feature that your target database has. It's already there, namely the database itself has implemented it already. And it just saves you a whole bunch of work. And it also works in every language, because every language has SQL bindings if you want to do, or Postgres binding. Anyway, so this is my idea. there's one SQL file for an upgrade and one SQL file for a downgrade. And you can just store these in the file system. Also, because just files doesn't really work, you need some way in which that determines the order in which you need to apply certain migrations, because one can depend on the previous one, and that one can depend on a bunch of other things. You need some sort of file which contains the order in which to run stuff, and just make the user edit upgrades and downgrades. And then that's what I would propose.
It's also pretty common to number them or timestamp them or whatever.
Yeah.
Either one works.
Yeah, so this is a file structure that you could have, right? So some config. This is like index. I named it index, but it's an overloaded term, so we might use something else when we start implementing it. But this one contains the order in which to run these, and these are like all the migrations. So config, it's JSON, right? So localhost, usernames, passwords, which database it is. And this is the list of migrations to run. If you go back a bit, you have one file with .up and one file with .down. Sometimes the down migration might be missing, like if it's irreversible or destroying data or whatever. Sometimes you are at the point in time and you apply a migration, you cannot go back, legal compliance, blah, 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 blah. So these aren't there, but these are like pointers to whatever. And because we also at a certain point need to know like which migrations have already been applied to the database, they probably need some sort of identifier or number or hash or like 8-byte string. That's the cyan part. We can store that in a table in the database itself, and then we have some way to reason about the current state of affairs. So how does that sound?
That's cool.
Are you reasonably convinced this is something that could work? Are you maybe also?
It'll work. It's kind of imperative and not necessarily.
Yeah.
It's not a sort of declarative interface where you're saying, here's what I want this to look like, figure it out for me. It's a lot more manual.
Yeah.
But perhaps that's what we want.
Yeah. Are you also slightly disappointed that this isn't the fanciest thing ever, and we haven't talked about any type level programming yet? Yeah, so apologies if you came for something like that. That's a whole different way of doing software. It doesn't really fit with my expertise or the way I think about things. Not saying that isn't a valid way of doing things. I just hope to show you this kind of stuff. And we'll see if we run into problems, try to fix the problems when we run into the problems, and not do it the other way around where you have a solution and search for a problem. It's more flame, sorry. So, oh yeah, we have this, and then the migrations are just like SQL like this, right? So, yeah, that's it. That's actually my final slide. The rest that we're going to do is code. So I'll post a link to a GitHub repo in the Discord. Let's see how I'm going to do this. Nope. And that's something you can, I should have put it on the slide, but you can also, actually, you can go to this GitHub page. That might be easier. Can everyone read this okay? That's nice. And there you'll find, sorry. So GitHub is on the left. There you'll find an exercises file. And it will tell you to stack setup things, stack build things. That I already did that. And it will tell you to get Postgres installed. So I expect this might be interesting. So I hope, since it's like a database program, and database programs tend to explode in your face, if, well, Postgres generally doesn't. They can be tricky to persuade into what you want them to do. So I hope we'll be able to figure that out together on all the different platforms that you're running. I found out some instructions for Ubuntu and Debian and Arch. Ubuntu and Debian give you the most prepackaged version, and Arch shows the manual version here. Yeah, that's as far as I'm going to get. If you're on Windows, I can try to help, but only, I think, if it's in the Linux subsystem. So yeah, code, Postgres, and then we'll, further down in the exercises file, there is, right here, there is some commands that you can also run to set up permissions and roles and that kind of stuff. And we'll take things from there. And if you have any questions or need help of any form, then please raise your hand or shout or whatever, and I'll come help you. Is anyone who's having trouble installing Postgres, or is there already? Who finished it already? Also no. All right.
opportunities?
Oh yeah, you can start it using.
It's common. WSL is probably.
Yeah.
System CTL. Yeah, try run it different way.
Oh, yeah, I haven't tried this lot. There is. Did you run the initdb command? That sounds like you probably need to install it first or something. Oh, interesting. Can you type? Can I try something?
Sure.
Maybe this. That's interesting. The question is, oh, you can probably.
Yeah, I can, you know, it's WSL, so it has some gaps there, so probably just download it normally in Windows.
Yeah, you can also maybe try the Postgres apt repo. If you're on Debian in WSL, then you can. Postgres has their own apt repositories, so you could add them, and then you can instead of using the official Debian apt repo. So if you go to the Postgres website, I can probably show you where you can. If you search for Postgres apt repo, maybe this works. Linux downloads, Debian. Yep. Yeah, so that's not a command, but that's something you need to add to the etc blah blah file, and then you can etc app sources.list.d. And afterwards, you get the wget command, then apt install should hopefully work.
I'll give it a try.
Okay, thanks. Cheers. Can I help anyone? Yeah.
How do you go about exploring stuff? I have like very little knowledge of Haskell. Like when I start Stack Rapper, I'm going to see all the available stuff on libraries, and I type this doesn't work.
Oh yeah, one of the things you can do is go to stackage.org, and if you're there, right here, if you search for connection info, then that's for SQLite. You'll have more luck if you search for PostgreSQL-simple here, and then you'll get to the page, the Haddock page of. Nah, that won't work. It's probably something like this. And then you end up with the library documentation. Then you can go here, and this shows you all the library docs for things. Let's see, anyone else need help? If you want, yes. I don't know anything about Docker, sorry. So I can't help you there. But yeah, it's probably from Postgres, run something. Anyone else that would like some setup? Yeah. Did you run the grand something role?
Yes, I run all of them.
Okay. And then, what does it say?
It says
Are you? If you change, did you change the username from? Oh yeah.
yeah, I changed this and the password.
Yeah. If you change, what's the database you created?
Also this thing. I need to.
You also need a database. So the second argument to the CLive PSQL is the database name. It's not the yeah. Okay, I see how you. Yeah. So if you just remove that one. But if you, can you get it to work or not? Oh, it's trying to do peer authentication. Pass the W flag to PSQL. Capital W? Yeah. No,
No, it's definitely. The login password.
Yeah. Can you sudo w postgres PSQL? Which you did get in. This one did work. Can you type select star from PG_user? Colon. Huh.
Password was indeed password.
So your login password is password there instead of which operating system are you on? Ubuntu. Can you edit? Can you open etsy/postgresql/10/pg_hba.com? 10 or 11, which depending on which version. pg_hba.com. Probably need sudo. Yeah. And then scroll all the way down. This should work. I don't know why this is not working for you.
Can try with the.
You can also try. Yeah, you can also sudo stack exec everything later. That also works. Yeah. So this is. Do people still need help? Yes. This is the problem with software. Right? All right, you're on a Mac?
Yeah.
Okay. And the stack,
Stack?
config is required but not installed. I think it's saying the program pgconfig is required but could not be found. So then the question will be, how do we get pgconfig on brew?
Maybe.
Mm-hmm.
This should be there. Almost unit stuff is there.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like it's not.
See if we can find you something.
Okay, I'll just search.
Yeah, I'll try something as well. Anyone else needs help? Mm-hmm. Okay. Try some stuff.
It's Ruby Jam.
Ah, that's interesting. Config Ruby. Yeah. Are you? How did you install PostgreSQL? Did you type brew install PostgreSQL, or?
No, I just typed stack build
Ah.
and started to install it.
Ah, okay. Do you have Postgres itself installed?
I didn't do it. I don't know if it's on board.
I think you should try brew install PostgreSQL. Then afterwards you may have.
Everything is right.
All right. That should get you something which has pgconfig.
Yeah.
And then.
Actually, I don't have permission to edit gems in library Ruby gems. It's not mine.
Yeah, that's probably.
It's
That should work.
company. But yeah,
But this one should give you pg_config, and then stack build should work,
yeah.
hopefully. Right.
Thanks.
Cheers. Yes.
It's not named connection info.
Oh.
That's why I couldn't find it. It's called connect info.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that.
It's fine.
That's a good thing to note. If you get to the point where it says connection info in the exercises, it's not called connection info, it's called connect info. I'll push the change up on GitHub, but there's a typo in the type name. I also see that it is officially time for a break.